Safia Usmani, and this is Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 new brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields and lives and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today is Wajiha Saqib. Wajiha did a master's in education policy from the George Washington University. She's an education researcher currently pursuing a doctoral program at UT Austin, and is also a founder of a startup for Urdu language teaching called Alif Se Yeh. Hi Wajiha, how are you?
I'm doing well. What about you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for taking out time for this episode today.
No, thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. Wajiha, so let's just get right into it. How about we just begin with talking about your doctoral program at UT Austin?
Yeah, so Safia, I'm doing a doctoral in education policy, and just to begin with, I have a huge passion for teaching, for education, and my undergrad was not in education or in the social sciences. It was actually in computer science, but then I got into research related to education and technology, and that's when I realized that this a vast world of education that needs to be explored, especially when right after my research in education technology, I got into teaching high school computer science, and that was in one of the private schools in Islamabad. And that's when I realized, I'm like, it's all good, teaching is all good, but there's a lot of policy making that happens which affects the classroom, but the people inside the classroom don't have a say. Right, the teachers don't have a lot of say in policy making, the students don't have a lot of say in policy making. And that's when I realized that it's people like us who have been in the education system or education sector, that we need to go and do something about policy making. So that's when I started applying for master's programs in education policy. I got into I got the Fulbright scholarship to go and do my master's in education policy, and from George Washington University. And while I was doing my master's and studying all these systems, I realized that there's a huge need for research, specifically in Pakistan, about education policy making, education systems and structures. And so after Fulbright, I came back to Pakistan. I worked in the nonprofit sector because I felt like that I have the experience of teaching in a school, but I do need to look into the nonprofit sector and see how educational projects are done in the NGO sector. So that's when I worked there. I also taught a university class at one of the local universities in Islamabad, which was also related to education. And then I got interested in, I'm like, I have to get into this research. So that's when I started applying for PhD programs. And well, it worked out in such a way that my Fulbright residency came to an end, and I also got into the PhD program at UT.
Can you just dig deeper into the research that you're doing as part of your PhD?
In education policy, there are a lot of themes. There's governance, there's structure, there's different kinds of schools. My interest is in understanding public-private partnerships in education. In the US, public-private partnership schools are called charter schools. In Pakistan or in other countries, it's mostly they're usually either referred to as PPP schools, public-private partnership schools. So in Pakistan, there's a lot of work going on along those lines. So in the US, charter schools have been there for quite some decades, but in Pakistan, in Pakistan, the movement also started a few decades ago, but now it's really getting, a push. Punjab has a lot of public-private partnership schools. Sindh and KP are also working along those lines, but Punjab is doing a lot. So I'm specifically interested, my research interest, it looks at how when you have schools that are publicly funded but privately managed, how are they how well they perform when it comes to when it comes to measuring the indicators of education equity, or equitable education as we call it, or education for all. So I'm interested in looking at that, but I'm looking at that from a very from a leadership perspective, how competition is being perceived in such systems. And one of the other things that I'm really looking into is that how this leadership responds to equitable education and equitable education outcomes depending on their gender. So basically, the term that I use is gendered perception of competition in public-private partnership schools.
Fascinating. So I have so many questions now, but okay, first thing, how is competition perceived? What does your research tell you?
Yeah, so the thing is, if you understand the market forces that are in play in private education generally, they lead to competition, especially in private schools. You know that even in the private schools in Pakistan, we see that there's competition, school choice, parents, tend to change their schools according to which schools are performing better. But when it comes to public-private partnership schools, it's a little different, because the funding is coming from the government. It doesn't operate like a business, right? In the sense of profit making. So that profit making is not happening, which happens in the private schools. So in that case, competition plays a part, because the government also has, it checks and regulates how these schools work. So they have these standardized tests, like, for example, in Punjab, these schools are called, one of the programs is foundation assisted schools. And the school has to, all the students in the school, they have to take a test twice a year called quality assurance test. Right. And on the basis of the performance of that test, the government decides whether the school would remain in the program of the foundation assisted schools or not. So you do realize, when the government funding is linked with the performance of the school, then competition is of different nature, right? Because then the schools are competing against each other to make sure that they perform well enough to stay in the program and get the government funding. So there have been studies about how in charter schools or public-private partnership schools, competition works. But I think it's very interesting that to understand how is that competition perceived differently by principals or school directors, if they are male or if they're female, right? Because competition generally in any field is perceived differently by men and women, right? So that is something that I'm really interested in, finding out. And I'm in the initial stage of my research, so let's see how that turns out to be. But I'm hoping to get some good results that would actually, my goal is that my research should have an impact on real systems, right? So if it's happening, if I do research, for example, if I do research on something like foundation assisted schools, right, then whatever research says should help that program, that specific program, to improve itself, or so it's always a long shot, but you always hope that your research has impact in real life. So I'm hoping, let's see, I'm working on it. I have to collect a lot of data for this and see what's happening, but that's all in the process. So hopefully, fingers crossed, maybe.
Fingers crossed, right? What you said, it's a long shot for sure. But then again, the one thing that is really needed in anything that one aspires to do is passion, right? So, and I can clearly see a lot of that here. Before we move on to the gendered nuance that you mentioned, I would like to comment on the PPP, framework of education. I once did this documentary in Punjab, actually, this school system in, these small towns. And I really was impressed by the whole system of, almost like, it looked like to me a sort of accountability on parts of teachers, because generally when we were growing up, what we saw in schools, we were privileged enough to go to, let's just say, better schools than majority of the people in Pakistan, right? Where the idea is such that the teachers are not accountable to anything, and all the testing and all the competition and all the challenges are only there for the students to prove themselves, right? And there's nobody asking anything from the teachers. They're the gods, the demigods, right?
Exactly.
I love that concept of holding teachers accountable, having these regular tests in schools and the administration of schools, the entire structure of the school system, making them think about the entire, how can they improve not just their performance, but the performances of their kids. So it's almost like a family working towards growth together. Having said that, let's just dive into the gender nuance that you talked about, because we see that not just in the education sector, in everything around us, right? But how is it more amplified in the education sector?
Yeah, so the thing is, in the education sector in Pakistan, there are things that we'll see which are different. In the US, you'll see gender playing in a different way, gender playing a role in the education system in a different way. I'll tell you something really interesting. In Pakistan, we say the girl child problem, which is the education of the girl child that right now a lot of NGOs are working on. The World Bank is working on that. A lot of other Brookings Institute and all of these bigger organizations are really interested in the problem of the girl child and her education. And that's a huge concern, because in Pakistan, girls tend to drop out at a very early stage for various reasons. I did a policy brief back when I was in my master's, and I presented it in a conference. And we talked about, it was me and my friend, and we talked about how the dropout rate is impacted. The dropout rate of girls is impacted by the unavailability of washrooms in schools, or or separate washrooms. Sometimes there are no washrooms, and sometimes when there are washrooms, they're not separate washrooms for girls. And that is a huge concern for parents, because they don't want to say, especially when the girls hit puberty. So it's like, if they're in grade 1 or 2, they still go to school, but by the time they're in grade 4 and 5, parents are not comfortable sending their girls alone to these fields to use the washroom, right? And so, and I understand it's a huge concern of security. And we did realize that it's not that parents don't want to teach their daughters. It's just that the opportunities and the infrastructure, especially in rural areas, does not support that. Now, that's the problem that's happening in Pakistan with gender playing an important role in the education of girls. But it's also in the US, it's the other way around. In the US, they found that they frame that problem as the boy turn, which is that a lot of girls, when it comes to achievement, a lot of girls, they end up scoring better than boys. Boys are lagging behind in attendance. They're lagging behind. Their dropout rates are increasing, and that could be due to different factors. And then if you look at people of color, right, students of color, then the problem even widens. So it's very interesting how gender is playing a different kind of problem. It's playing a different kind of part in the US system, right? However, when you look at leadership in Pakistan, most principals in schools, whether that's a private school or that's a public school or even a public-private partnership school, you would see that most principals are female, right? Whereas in the US, most of the principals and most of the leadership in schools is male. So, I mean, it's a very interesting thing to look at, that what is happening. We have the girl child education problem, but our education leadership is mostly consists of women, right? Whereas in the US, they have the boy child education problem, if I put it that way, but their principals or their school leadership is male dominated. So that's interesting. Gender plays different parts in education. My specific interest is to look at how the gender of the school leadership in a public-private partnership setup or in a charter school setup, that is impacting competition. Because I feel like in even in the US and in Pakistan, we're moving more towards a business-like setup of general education systems, or just generally schools, right? And so I need to see that how leadership is impacting education in a way that ends up being equal in the context of gender. And I also want to look at how in this whole scenario, the gender of the leadership plays a part.
But Wajiha, interesting that you talked about the boy child, boy turn concept in the US. I want to kind of talk about this thing for a bit, because if you look at Pakistan and the Pakistani school system, right? Yes, I have also seen from experience that, parents, and especially in rural areas and small towns, are reluctant to send their girls to schools for many reasons. Maybe the infrastructure doesn't support that, maybe, and cultural reasons, izzat, honor, all of those things, or poverty, that they have to send their girl child, or even boy, kids, any kids, whatever gender, to, their kids, to, help them with the farming and everything, right? That is one thing, which basically means the attendance is getting affected, right?
Yeah.
Of the kid. But then the other issue that you mentioned about the US is also there in Pakistan, right, Vijaya? Because we have seen when girls and guys are together, girls and boys are together in the class, and they're given the same kind of support by teachers, whatever the gender of the teacher is, we do see girls excel more,
Yeah.
right? We have seen metric may, inter may, girls getting more positions, and then something shifts, because right after they get out of the structured education system, boys tend to do better in the society, right? And girls are somehow, they just disappear. So we do see that thing in Pakistan as well.
Yes, exactly, Safia. And that's a very interesting thing. You're talking about when the opportunity is equal, but unfortunately, there's not equal opportunity right now in Pakistan, right? So that's why we see that girls' dropout rates are higher, right? And maybe even their achievement is also suffering because of the lack of equal opportunity. But I also feel like that even if there is equal opportunity, and if there's a difference in gender, if there's a, let's say, significant difference, right, in the performance of girls and boys in any society, whether that's Pakistan or the US, then the next step would be to understand how teaching should be done in such a way that the results are almost similar for both boys and girls, right? And that would be the next step, right? When we have equal opportunity. So I completely agree with you that problem, that when there is equal opportunity, girls end up performing better than boys. That happens given that there's equal opportunity. And then it becomes a question of teaching. Do we need to teach boys and girls differently? Do we need to have different pedagogical methods to actually address the learning, the learning of boys and girls? So I agree with you that problem is there. But I think that I'm looking at it, I'm taking a step back, and I'm looking at it, what kind of equal opportunity is missing, and what context, and how can that equal opportunity be addressed so that this problem doesn't rise, right? And once we are at a point where we realize that there is equal opportunity, and now both boys and girls are getting the same kind of opportunity to learn, if we find that there is there's a significant difference in their learning, then we need to come to pedagogy. And I think a lot of people are working on that. There's a lot of research that's happening on, should boys and girls be taught in different ways, and then there's also research going on in separate, all boys and all girls school, right? So this internationally as well, they're looking into, do boys perform better in an all boys school? Do girls perform better in an all girls school? So that's also going on. And I hope that once the equitable education concern is met, then that question of the difference in performance can also be addressed.
I'm interested in understanding, something that you talked about a little while ago, the leadership positions, and how, different genders and different leadership roles can completely change the dynamics of a school system. If you could elaborate a little more about that.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting when you have competition, when you have a market-like system and competition at play, and schools are competing with each other. Parents are actually, school choice, the whole idea of school choice is based on competition. Parents are selecting schools on the basis of which school is performing better. And then you bring in the money, right? The funding with it. If the funding is following the student, then every school is competing for the student, right? Because more students mean more money, more funding. So in that scenario, how is competition being perceived by the leadership impacts how they respond to that competition, right? So do they actually focus on implementing policies that would lead to better education, equitable education opportunities, or are they more focusing on just student attendance and increasing their student attendance? And I think I'm currently doing a research study in one of the states in the US where we're looking at perception of competition by leadership, by school leadership, and how in charter schools, and we're looking at how they're responding to different competition. However, one thing that I really think matters is your gendered perception, right? So in any competitive environment, men perform differently than women, right? Research says in sports, women are less competitive when they are in a mixed group setting, right? And men are more competitive, they have more self-confidence, or sometimes they even term it as overconfidence, right? So I think that happens in sports, and research says that, men perceive competition very differently than women, right? But what does that say about leadership in schools, right? If that's happening in the sports field, right, and competition is being perceived differently, then how does that impact how competition is being perceived by female principals and male principals? And what are they doing? What policies are they making? Or how are they changing their school policies to cater to the question of equitable education? And are there significant differences in how men are doing it and how women are doing it? Is one way of doing it better than the other way of doing it? Is one way of doing it more effective? So obviously, I'm really concerned about that, and I think that does make, because even in our observation, you see, I for most part of my life, I have studied in schools where the principals were females, and I had a really good experience with those female principals. But I would like to know what it is like when the leadership is male, right? And does it have the same impact? Does it have a different impact? So I hope that answers the question.
It does. I still kind of want to dig in a little more into this. I understand your research, what you're currently doing is also partly based in, the US, but it kind of takes me back to, the cultural nuances as well, right? What you said about how gender is perceived from the outer layer, right? I saw during my experience in Punjab again, in, the small towns and villages, when the schools with female leadership or even male leadership were trying to attract more girls, students, they would send their outreach teams to houses, to parents to talk to them. And mostly if they would have just men in the outreach team, they would make sure there were enough women to go along with them, so that, a perception is created that there are women in the school to help them with that. And that comforted the parents. And there's a lot of culture, associated here, because then the parents would be like, okay, if my girl is going there, if there are more women who look a certain way, by the way, then there's entire, the performance of it, so that they look more relatable, they look more compassionate, motherly, and all, because these are like more feminine traits. Now I'm talking about,
Yeah.
it's apart from gender. Now we're talking about, what feminine traits to be exuberated to attract girl kids, what masculine traits they might not work, the same feminine traits might not work to attract the male kids, right? The boys. And then you have to exuberate certain masculine traits. I'm sure you must have seen such findings as well.
Yeah, so you know what, there's been research about that boys, and this is research from the US that says that if boys study in an all boys classroom, they perform better, right? And of course you can delve into why is that so, what is happening, are they seeing you know, if the teacher is also male, the students are all male, right? Are they being reaffirmed about, you know, about the masculine traits that you're talking about? I mean, and there's a lot that can be investigated there. But one thing that I really like that you said about culture. In Pakistan, actually, you're right. In Eastern societies, the way gender is perceived is very different from how it is perceived in the Western societies. And I will say that yes, historically, even in the Western societies, teaching has been considered a profession for women. You know, and it has been dominated by women. However, it's interesting that in Pakistan, the profession of principals is also dominated by women, right? Whereas mostly in most cases, I think, other than all boys schools where you would find the principals to be male. If it's a co-education school, then you would probably have a woman being the principal than a male. And and this is just my intuition, that of course in a society where boys and girls are in a school there where boys and girls are studying together, in a society that is more protective of girls, right, parents would prefer a female principal than a male principal, because they would want their girls' concerns to be attended to, right?
Yeah,
exactly. So I would say that this is interesting, because in the US, you know, you wouldn't need the outreach example that you said. In the US, the outreach would happen at the level of the staff, which is female dominated, right? But in Pakistan, the outreach would happen, it would be led by the principal, right? And then they would actually make sure that the outreach happens. So that, I think, is a very interesting comparison that we can do, and we can see. And because I am looking into comparative analysis of even gender perception of competition, so I'm interested to see that what are the factors in Pakistan that affect gendered perceptions of competition, and what are the factors in the US, and are there any similar factors? Are there entirely different? Is it only is it specifically contextual, right? Or is it, or are there any overlaps there? So I think that is definitely very interesting and very important to look at. So I agree with you that context and culture matters wherever you are. However, it's one thing I would say, that sometimes I have seen that the cultural differences are not that different in the global north and global south, right? We do think, oh, US is a developed country, but they have a lot of issues in the education system which are very similar to what we experience here in Pakistan. So I think it is worth studying and comparing these two or any global north or global south societies, to see what are the common problems, and what are things that are very contextual and specific to cultures.
Something very interesting that you talked about, the segregated schools in terms of gender, and how kids in either boys or girls tend to perform very well in their schools. And this is a new perspective that I got just now, because I also think about this a lot, because many women who went to an all women college, let's just say, or men who went to an all men's school, they do tend to do really well in life. And it could be a reason because they get so much validation for, their attributes and qualities that they are performing around them, because they, it's almost like mirroring, and they feel like, okay, there's so much strength in validation, right? So that was a very interesting point. Having said that, this is so much work, Wajiha, like so much research. It must be taking so much time and energy. How do you find time for your startup then?
Well, Safia, I have to tell you that it's PhD is, no piece of cake. It is hard work.
It's not.
Yeah, but first of all, I would have to say that the startup is something that is now completely led by my team, right? So initially when I founded it, I had not started my PhD. So it worked time-wise. I started it, the initial beginnings of the startup, they started like 7-8 years ago, before it was actually a startup. But I started teaching Urdu to diplomats in Islamabad. And, just to tell you, I have, as I told you in the beginning, that I have a huge passion for teaching, right? So, I mean, teaching is something that I cannot let go of, whether I'm doing research or not. Teaching is something that I'm absolutely addicted to. So, but teaching Urdu is something that came about very. It just happened. I've been passionate about Urdu literature. I mean, ever since even before my high school, I was always into studying classical Urdu literature, Manto and Ismat Chugtai, Ahmad Nadeem Qasmi, and all of those great names. And I was always, and then back in my undergrad, I was a computer science major, but I had these electives. So I would take my electives from the Urdu literature department, just, so that I can get to do some research in Urdu literature. And then I was lucky, I got some really good teachers who were really good mentors. So what happened was that when I was doing a job in Islamabad, I've always wanted to do something that is my passion other than my daily routine. So I started teaching Urdu to diplomats because that was something that I really, really loved. And when I started teaching it to them, I started from scratch. I started getting the resources. I started making a pedagogy. And in about a year, I was able to come up with a whole pedagogy because this is Urdu taught as a foreign language. So it's not like, it's not something that you study in your O levels or in your metric. This is Urdu taught as a foreign language. And for English, we have the TESOL course, I think, English as a second language. But for Urdu, we have no courses like these. So it was really difficult to make something that starts from that. And then how I got to change it into a startup. It happened over years, but it did happen. And then I got to train a team. So now the only, coming back to your question, the good thing is that my team is well trained. It's a small team, but it's well trained to lead the operations of the startup. And I now I have a more of an advisory role. So I feel like that just helps me to get my PhD work done.
So a lot of delegation happening for growth.
Yeah.
Alif Se Yeh, that's what your startup is called, right? And you started it as your passion for teaching Urdu language as a foreign language to delegates. Is that still what the startup is doing, or has it expanded to more staff?
Yeah, so initially it was Urdu language teaching, but one thing that really, so when I was in the US, I realized I was teaching foreigners and people in Islamabad, but when I was in the US, I realized that there's a huge demand for in the South Asian diaspora of going back to their roots and learning Urdu. And that was the time when there were a lot of people who wanted to learn Urdu Shairi. So we started a volunteer group of teaching Urdu Shairi, right? And when I came back from after my Fulbright, when I came back, that's when the Urdu language teaching started again, and now this time it was online, because initially it was in person when I was before going for my master's study. And in the US, I saw this market, and when I came back, I thought that if we really want to teach people who are living in the US or Canada and UK, then we need to offer these classes online. So we started online teaching, and that's when my sister joined me. She's, I mean, my family has an extra special love for Urdu, so she joined me. I trained her with all the pedagogy that I had made. Then what happened was that we also, my other sister, she was really into Shairi, and she said that so the volunteer group that I started in the US, she wanted to start one here in Islamabad. So then we started our Shairi sessions for youth. So the Shairi sessions for youth, they're completely free. So the teaching services are paid, but the Shairi sessions are completely free. We have 3 chapters. So we have one chapter in the US, which started in Washington, DC when I was in my grad school. And then the second is the one that we started here in Islamabad. And that all of these are hybrid. So they have a virtual component and an in-person component. And then there's a Shairi session. So these 2 Shairi chapters, they are for youth, But the third one that we started was for people for all ages, because we had some senior citizens come to us and they're like, you don't include us in the youth sessions. So what do we do? And like, okay, fine. So what we'll do is we'll let those youth sessions run as they are, but we'll have a separate session where there will be no age restriction and anyone can come. So that is happening. That's the third chapter. And all of these 3 Shairi sessions, we call them our Shairi chapters. They're free, right? And so Urdu language teaching is happening, but then there was a demand for Urdu literature classes. So we started Urdu literature classes for beginners, for intermediate level learners. And the third thing that really happened, because when we were teaching Urdu, the people came and asked us, do you provide translation services from Urdu to English and English to Urdu? And then we saw that there's a need. So we came, so some of my friends, some of the people in my family, we came together and we're like, this is something that we can do. And, we've been doing so much for Urdu. So translation is one thing that we have the skills and we have the ability. So now we have a translation team that does the translation and the transcription or transliteration. So we provide those services as well to different organizations, whether they're research organizations or corporate organizations or NGOs. So we do that. So there are 3 things right now that's happening. So the teaching, language and literature teaching, Shairi chapters, and the translation services. The Shairi chapters are free. The translation and the teaching part is their paid services. We are trying to expand it in such a way that we're trying to, just to answer your question completely, we're trying to include more South Asian languages, to teach more South Asian languages. So right now we're training a Sindhi teacher and a Punjabi teacher. So we're hoping to have Sindhi and Punjabi classes soon. Then we're also looking for people who would be interested in, offering courses for promoting South Asian culture, right? So that is not necessarily related to Urdu, but let's say related to arts, or, something like calligraphy, or something like, we had a course, one of our members designed it, called South Asian Cinema. So because he had studied film studies, so it was really well designed and related to, filming, but from a South Asian context. So yeah.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. You cannot imagine how much joy it brought me when I read about, your startup, because we have to take pride in our language, right? And a lot of us do, but some of us may have forgotten the beauty that it brings. You might have also noticed, because you're really into it, right, that how in our parts of the world, in our country, people are just so proud in saying, oh, I don't understand Urdu, right? They wouldn't be so proud in saying the same thing for English. That's going to be embarrassing for them. But somehow, and then I really am so happy that these movements, it's almost like a movement of decolonization that's happening, to just, take more pride in our own language, in our own culture. And that's why it makes me happier that you just said that you're expanding onto other languages as well, Sindhi and other languages in our South Asian, part of the world. Thank you so much, because you're doing so much, Wajiha, and I don't think this conversation or just, half an hour of conversation would do justice to that. But I had so much fun learning about so many interesting things that you're doing. Thank you so much for taking out your time.